So thanks for hanging out with me to talk about what it takes to build a smarter learning ecosystem. As introduced, I'm JD. I'm the chief learning architect at a learning technology company near Toronto called Exonify, and I'm the founder and principal of my own company called LearnGeek. So for those I haven't met before, I've spent the last 20 or so years in corporate learning and operations roles. Given that we're all in the Central Florida region, I don't have to go in nearly as much of an explanation as where I've worked, because y'all know these companies. So, and there's the obvious Mickey sitting over my shoulder, represent my time at Disney. So I focus today a lot on the frontline workplace and the needs of frontline employees, but I've supported a wide range of people in a variety of different types of industries and roles, especially in the work that I do now with Exonify, where we support frontline forward and frontline enabled organizations around the world. So it's awesome to be with you here today. I said it earlier, it's kind of an odd day because this morning I did a presentation for a team from Philadelphia, and I'm from Philadelphia, and now I'm doing a presentation for Central Florida, and I live in Central Florida. So I guess it's my day when it comes to presentations. So today's conversation is actually not as much about learning as it is about the idea of change and how we as talent development professionals can help our organizations and the people that we support keep up with change. And remember when like change and disruption were like fun things to talk about, and sometimes they're part of a plan and those types of ideas. And change nowadays feels a little bit more like this, and we all know what this feels like. Usually I kind of have to explain what this feels like to some people that I'm talking to, but we all know this. And the reality is that the working world before this year was already rapidly evolving around us and challenging us in learning and development to try to keep up with what organizations were requiring and people were being asked to do on the job. So changes were everything from a large number of organizations redesigning jobs to the big conversation around reskilling and what skills will people need moving into the future of the workplace. The idea that talent development and the opportunity to improve was already a differentiating factor. So the idea of being able to learn and develop on your job was a reason people were picking or staying with organizations. And there was this growing shift towards the need to have support and have training and have resources available as part of the daily working experience. So our world was already changing around us, and then this year happened, and it fundamentally shifted the nature of work, both for folks like us, a lot of us who can work from home as part of our roles, as well as those on the front line who have been going in to clock in every day for every shift since the changes began. So everything we were already thinking about and the fact that we were trying to keep pace just accelerated. Things that we thought might take years took 6 weeks. I'm preaching to the choir in various regards, but this really, for me, connects to my experience in learning and development, where I've always felt a little bit like a certain coyote in a certain cartoon as he's chasing a certain roadrunner, copyright Warner Brothers. And what happens to that coyote? Well, he has great plans and great equipment, and he's got the best that Acme can provide. And he thinks it's going to work out, and he's going to catch the roadrunner. But then something happens, and at the end of the cartoon, the coyote's at the bottom of a cliff with an anvil on his head. And have you ever felt that way in this profession? Because we have the best plans, we know what we're going to do, and then suddenly something changes. And now that's basically the name of the game. So even before this year, but especially now, there's a fundamental challenge with our ability to leverage our traditional tactics, as I refer to as place and time learning, as the foundation of what we do. I'm not a person who sits here and says things have to stop or go away, but it's really challenging people in our profession around the world to rethink the way that we approach learning and development. And this matches up with a lot of the conversation going on out there around this idea of an ecosystem, about thinking more broadly and holistically about what learning is inside of an organization, how people get better at their jobs and develop their skills every day. But it comes down to, before we can start to think about the tools and the tactics and the content, we really have to evolve the way we think about learning and development, the work that we do every day, and help others develop a new mindset when it comes to the role of learning inside of an organization. We have to adopt what I refer to as a modern learning organization mindset. That includes a variety of different ideas, but it starts with thinking about learning as a critical part of work, not something that is separate from work or always has to remove you from work, but learning as part of everyone's job so that they can keep pace with the way that the workplace is changing around them. About it taking advantage of the full ecosystem, not just things we control, not just things we own, not just platforms that we administer, but a larger picture of everything we can do to help people get better at their jobs. About the role that data plays in helping us become more agile and more proactive so we can make sure that what we're doing, the solutions that we're providing, are actually helping people move the needle when it comes to their performance. about the personal side of learning, that learning is always a personal experience. Even if someone is consuming content that we make them take, they are still making the decision about how they engage and if they're going to walk away from that experience with the information they need to improve their performance. It's about impact. Because if what we're doing doesn't actually move that needle, doesn't help people do their jobs better, and doesn't lead to the results the organization is looking to see, what was the point in making sure that organizations understand the value that we bring so that we get the investment we need to do our best work? And finally, fostering that ongoing organizational agility. So making sure that we can pivot as quickly as we need to, even in times like these when we don't know necessarily where we're going and what the next priority, the next challenge is going to be for our organizations. So during our time today, we got like 40 minutes or so. What is the point? So what are we going to try to accomplish today? And when I have conversations like this with organizations around the world, what am I trying to accomplish? One, I really want to help us break the course mentality in learning and development. Courses are not bad. Courses do not go away, but they should not be the default mechanism by which we try to help people do their jobs better. So how do we break that fundamental mentality, both in learning and development and with the people that we support? How can we create a rapid, consistent, scalable approach to solving problems? How can we move as fast as the business requires us to move so that people can be able to do what they need to do their jobs safely and productively? How can we make smarter decisions when solving performance problems? Do just the work that's required in order to help the organization overcome that next hurdle? And how do we provide a balanced experience? Because employees are not just trying to solve the day-to-day problems, they also need to be looking ahead to develop the skills they'll need to take that next step, to become the next manager, to take that next step in their long-term career. So how do we kind of build the right mechanisms and put the right tools in place so we can provide a balanced workplace learning experience? So those are my goals. And hopefully today you can walk away with a couple of new ideas, a new way to approach the way that you're solving problems within your work and within your organization, and maybe kickstart a conversation with the people that you work with, because I think this change needs to begin within the talent development, learning and development function, and then we can influence others, the people that we support, the people that we work with and work for, to think differently about the high value role we provide in learning and development. So that's what we're going to do today. So what I have are 4 steps that I work with organizations to walk through to help them build a smarter learning ecosystem, to bring a lot of the modern learning mindset ideas to life within their business, regardless of who they're supporting, whether it's people in the office, people on the front line, or some combination thereof. Step 1, map your learning ecosystem. Like I said, this conversation is not about getting rid of, it's not about replacing, it's not about we're doing anything wrong. It's about looking a little bit more closely at the practices we apply today and rethinking or reimagining how they can be applied in a way that better fits the reality of the people that we're supporting every day. So that starts with taking a look at your existing ecosystem, because whether or not you've used this term before, you have one, right? People are learning every day on their job. They're forgetting every day on their job. They're getting better at their job every day. They're solving problems every day. So how do we look, again, more holistically at everything that we're doing? And I don't know every organization is different. You use different tools, different tactics, different types of content. But generally speaking, when you think of everything that we do to help people learn at work, you can bucket those ideas into 6 different categories. And I'm going to dive into these buckets a little bit more detail shortly. But generally speaking, there's the structured stuff, there's the on-demand stuff, there's the coaching side of learning, there's practice, there's general kind of categories you can put everything that we do into. The question is, how are you applying these different categories of tactics? Well, when we graph them, let's basically build our house of training. So we're going to put the stuff that we tend to lean into as learning and development teams on the bottom as the foundation of our house. Then we're going to build up to the things that we don't do as much. And again, generally speaking, a lot of organizations fall into this structure, where the more programmatic side of learning is the basis, where we spend a lot of our time and a lot of our resources. And the less formal stuff is the stuff we don't often get to, is secondary. We don't necessarily solve those problems as much. So that's what our house tends to look like. Think about your own and how similar is this to what you're doing. But then let's add a dimension across the bottom axis of this graph. And that's going to be availability. How easy is it for the people that we're trying to help to get access to leverage these different categories of solutions as part of their day-to-day job? Because there's a simple reality we have to face. People don't go to work to learn. Learning is part of the job. A lot of people like to learn to do new things, but that's not why they're there. They're there to do the job. Doing the job often gets in the way because of how busy they are, especially if they're frontline employees where they're scheduled in a very regimented way. We were talking earlier about some shared experience we have in a contact center environment. Rule number one of a contact center is don't go off the phone. So in that environment, how do you fit the opportunity to learn, develop, solve problems into the day-to-day reality? So if we add availability of our traditional tactics to this graph, the picture starts to change, and it looks a little bit more like this. And if you were to add three-dimensional physics to this particular image, what would happen? And feel free to say it out loud wherever you are. What happens to this graph if it's like a Jenga tower, and those are all physical blocks? It does something like this. It falls over. And what we're left with is the more structured side of training, which is where, again, as an industry, we put a lot of our focus, time, and resources. But there's a disconnect between what people are able to do and fit and where we put a lot of our resources. And again, our goal in this conversation is to provide a consistent experience for every employee that fits into their reality of working inside of your organization. So it requires us to not get rid of anything, but to rethink and restructure the different tactics and restack them, but in a way that's based on access for the people who need it, based on availability to the employee, as well as our ability to rapidly deploy solutions into the organization. I was just talking to a different group about similar themes, and I said that I see learning and development needing to become better at plumbing, where it's less about the content that we make, while that's still an important part of our story, but more about the mechanisms and the tools and the tactics we put in place through which we can push whatever solution is needed as quickly as possible so people get the support they need when and where they need it. We need to install the plumbing, and then as things change around us, take advantage of that infrastructure that we build to solve the next problem, whatever it may be. So that's the idea I want to walk through in a little bit more detail. This idea that I use called a modern learning ecosystem to help organizations restructure the tactics that they've got and then close some of the gaps that they have. Because if you start thinking about, as I work through each layer, the different tools and mechanisms that might fit that you're using today into each layer, and maybe what layers are missing or what layers you have gaps in that you could improve to improve your overall ecosystem approach to learning. So step two, identify the tactics. I'm going to pause for a second to stare at the chat. Hi, could we see the first metric slide showing the data on employee learning and growth? Yes, the entire deck, in fact, is available, and I have a URL for it. So any slides that you missed, you can have all of these slides coming your way at the end of the presentation. It's always good at the end, right? Because then you got to hang out, and then you get the slide, not the beginning. Anyway, step two, identify tactics. So what, like I said, fits into these different pipes, if you will, within your organization? What are the different tools and tactics? So for me, the foundation of learning at work is shared knowledge. Access to timely information fundamentally changes everything about how a person does their job. And all you have to do to realize that I'm probably right is think about how you live your everyday life. How do you solve problems at home? Thanks, internet. Right? How many challenging issues are you able to overcome because you're able to access information in a very rapid and on-demand manner? But what happens when you go to work? Are you able to leverage those same behaviors? Are you able to solve problems just as effectively? And some of those problems may be more complicated and more proprietary and all those types of things, but it doesn't mean they're harder than the things that you're doing in everyday life. At one point, my refrigerator broke and I fixed it because there was a guy on YouTube who had solved the same problem and I didn't have to hire a repairman. But I go to work and I can't figure out how many vacation days I have left because we don't handle information in a way that helps people fundamentally do their jobs better. So for me, it's applying a range of potential tactics that help you install this foundational layer of helping people get to the information they need in a frictionless, seamless, rapidly on-demand way. So it could be everything from how you're leveraging your intranet, social technology. Microsoft Teams is now a big part of the equation. Slack is a part of the equation. I'm going to talk a lot about wikis. SharePoint fits in here. Job aids, user-generated content. All of these different ways that you can connect people to the information they need in a timely manner. And for me, during my evolution in a previous role, someone knows what I'm talking about, this is where everything really began because I noticed people coming to me and asking for training on a wide variety of topics. And when I started to hunt around as a person who was new to the organization, I was building the e-learning content for these topics. And I was looking around our SharePoint sites, trying to figure out where's the source information for these concepts that people want me to build e-learning for. And I couldn't find anything. And I had all of the access. So if I couldn't find anything, what was happening to the people on the front line doing the job every day? How are they finding information on these topics? And I quickly figured out we didn't have a training problem. We had an information flow problem where people shouldn't have to complete an e-learning module to get access to some basic product information. So we started down a path within this organization to solve a shared knowledge problem that no one said we had and no one asked for, but I fundamentally believe was actually at the heart of everything we were struggling with in learning and development. We started to build a wiki. This may look a little bit familiar to certain people in the room today. But the idea here was that we took some of the basic information that we knew people in this contact center needed as part of their job every day, and we put it in an easily accessed, familiar place. We had SharePoint. That wasn't working. We tried to make it work. That wasn't working. So we took a tool that was cheap and familiar because most people know how search works. Most people understand linking between content on the internet. And most human beings have used Wikipedia at some point in their lives. So we borrowed those ideas, but restructured them in order to provide actionable information on some of the most popular topics people were using as part of their jobs. Day one, when we launched this particular wiki, it just had 500 articles in it that my team entirely built on, again, some of the most common challenges that people in our audience were facing. By the time I left the organization, we had about 70,000 pieces of content built by hundreds of contributors because we truly made shared knowledge the foundation of what we were doing. Every time someone came to me and asked for training, my response was, what information is readily available on this particular topic that people can use in order to do their jobs more effectively and solve this problem? And then when the answer was nothing, I would say, let's build an article and start there. And when the article solved the problem, we didn't do anything else. Because why bother? When a job aid will fix it, why build a course? Clark Quinn, who's you might have heard of as an author in our profession, said the best thing he ever said to me was, you should do as little work as possible to solve the problem. And at first that sounds lazy, but in reality, if I do as little work to solve this problem as possible, I can put more resources towards a more complicated challenge. So shared knowledge for me, access to timely information, is the base of workplace learning. The next layer up is performance support. How do I raise my hand? So if I don't know, I can't find, I don't know how to fix this. A customer has a problem, I don't know how to solve it. How do I get help? And again, this will look different depending on your organization, the work people are doing, and the tools that you have. So it could be everything from social technology, chat tools, back into Microsoft Teams and Slack again, having a dedicated subject matter expert list. At a different company that I worked for, I became some type of a strange hero because I took the SME list that we were using to do training stuff and I published it so that every employee knew who to go to for things. Seems easy, but people really got a benefit from that. Question and answer areas, electronic performance support tools, a wide range of tools, but it all comes down to how do people raise their hand and get help? The answer should not be ask the guy next to you because that guy may be horrible at his job, and it can't be ask your manager because where's your manager right now? What else do they have to do? And there's a big secret that no one tells you in learning and development. Managers usually don't know how to do it either. So how do we overcome those challenges? Back to our wiki example. So in my particular case, we were using a wiki because it actually had commenting and social capabilities. So this is the bottom of that same article that you saw earlier, where people could come in and ask a question. One, we enabled them to get the answer as quickly as we could with my team acting as community managers in the beginning. So my team was monitoring the feed to make sure that when people asked a question, they got an answer. Not only that, we took the information from that question and answer experience and used it to improve the content so that people wouldn't have to ask that question again. They could just look it up because now that information was made available. And what was really interesting about this wiki exercise was a little bit down the path, several months in, I started to notice that my team was actually getting to answers slower than other people in the company. People who were doing the frontline work were showing up and answering questions on their own. And I cried a little bit when this started to happen because that was the goal, was to leverage the collective understanding and capability of our entire organization to help people get the help they needed when they need it and move us as learning and development further into the background and not make us this strange stopping point or blocker to people's ability to develop and solve problems. So again, keeping performance support as a foundational capability within your ecosystem. Now we're going to cross an important dividing line. This is when we cross the line between nice to know and need to know. There's an infinite amount of information within your organization. People know a lot of stuff. No one knows everything, even if they've been there 30, 40 years. But there's certain information that people need to know to be able to execute their jobs effectively. Think about airline pilots for making this as complicated as possible. There are a ton of job aids in the cockpit of an airplane, but there's certain things that they need to know without looking up in order to fly the plane safely. So how do we create that dividing line within our tactics in learning and development? Everything we talked about so far handles the nice to know, the things that you can look up to solve the problem when it arises, or maybe as you're getting better at your job if you're new to the organization. But now we're heading into the need to know, the more structured stuff that's going to help people have the right information top of mind so they can apply it in the moment of need. And that's where the layer reinforcement comes in. So if there's something missing from most organizations, it's probably this layer. How do people practice? How do they make sure that when they complete a course, when they go to a classroom session, when they work through an e-learning, that they remember that information top of mind when the moment arises? Because it's likely they're forgetting most of it when they walk away from the training, unless they're going to apply it almost immediately after they complete that exercise or complete that training experience. So again, reinforcement can look a lot of different ways. It could be structured practice activities. It could be question-based learning, asking people a couple of questions as part of their average day to challenge them to use their knowledge. Micro-learning and training bursts come into this idea. Huddle conversation to reinforce important conversations. Subscription learning, newsletters. There's a variety of ways to keep information in front of people, keep reminding them of what's most important, and not just asking people to consume content, but asking them to apply and challenge their knowledge, because that drives deeper retention. This is actually how I met my current employer. So at Exonify, in 2013, we primarily worked in question-based reinforcement, hence the example of a question on screen. So one of the things that we got started doing was introducing this idea of, if you just ask people 2 or 3 questions a day, what can it help people do? And I'm going to show you in the example at the end of bringing all these ideas together, how powerful, simple, brief practice exercises can be in helping people make better decisions on the job every day. Next layer up, here come the managers. Managers are a critical part of the overall ecosystem story. In fact, I believe frontline management are the most important people in workplace learning. They're more important than you and me. They're more important than the employees, and they're definitely more important than the executive team, because they're there every day influencing how work is done. And especially if they're working with employees who are scheduled on the front line, they control when people work, where they work, what their priorities are, what resources they have, what's important on the given day, what the topic of conversation is. They have tremendous influence over how people do their jobs. So if we don't consider them as part of our strategy, we have a major gap. And you might have experienced this like I have several times. Again, great strategy, great plan, program setup, executive buy-in, messages coming from the C-suite talking about how important this training program is going to be. And then something happens in the story right about the middle layer of management where the prioritization gets reinterpreted. Because does it match up with what the manager's held accountable to or thinks is important, or how they do things here? That's where managers come into play. But managers aren't necessarily hired because they're great teachers. Most managers, including myself when I was an operational manager, I was brought into a management role because I was good at the job, and now I'm suddenly in charge of other people doing the job. I wasn't trained to be a manager, to be a teacher, to be a leader per se. And that's the case with a lot of frontline managers. So we can't expect them to be great teachers. Some are amazing. Most are not. We can expect them to be effective coaches, because observing behavior, performance on the job, and providing timely feedback is a fundamental part of what's expected from a manager. So how do we enable managers to be better coaches? How do we prioritize their training to make sure it's not just the frontline employees we're talking about today? Are managers also being supported in all of the ways we're talking about? So a manager doesn't have to wait for the next training program in order to improve their coaching skills and everything that's required, especially right now. We're talking to managers a lot right now about de-escalation on the front line, especially if you work in a retail environment, a grocery environment. So we're making sure managers are getting support in addition to the frontline employees who are facing challenging circumstances on a regular basis. And I have a habit when I visit new clients or new organizations that I'm working with, I go into frontline roles, go into stores and things like that, and I'll ask the store manager, how did you get trained to be the store manager? And a lot of times I hear, well, they gave me the manager job, I got the responsibility, I've learned some stuff from other managers, and I'm still waiting for the next program. That doesn't work. and it's going to create a massive gap in our overall capability. So it's everything from manager training, coaching support, actionable reporting, making sure managers have the data that they need to have meaningful, targeted conversations with their employees. Again, feeding people potential practice activities, huddle conversation notes, helping managers overall be better at coaching their employees. And here's just an example of a dashboard that my team used a while back to get managers actionable reporting, not just on were the sales team members selling, but what did their knowledge look like? What did they know and not know? What training were they completing, right? How did their on-the-job behaviors look? Bringing all of this data together in an actionable way so that managers could really look into an individual's profile and have a more targeted conversation. Now we're getting to the more familiar stuff. Here's where the structured programmatic type of stuff pulls in. First, there's the pull side of training, providing a more structured path to curricula type of an approach, but something that people can access when and where they need it. So this is where access to on-demand content, portals, voluntary enrollment, these types of ideas come into play, but it's for the more complicated type of work. I put the picture of a piano on screen because I own a piano and I can't play the piano because none of my own layers of my own framework have worked for me yet. I'm now at the point where I need instruction to be able to ever learn how to play that piano. Otherwise, it's just a strange piece of furniture sitting in my living room. So I need to actually apply my own methodology to figure out how to learn the piano because it's a level of complexity I just can't figure out with any of the layers we've seen so far. I've tried every layer. Need to get to this point. In my experience back at that contact center, we used some video assets as part of an on-demand training exercise. So we wanted to get more information that was more practical, more structured about real priority problems out into the world, but we couldn't build courses on everything. We couldn't ask people to do training on everything we were doing because again, contact center, got to stay on the phone. So what we did was we went out to people in the operation who had street cred, who were recognized by their peers as knowing how to do certain things. We brought them into an office, we sat them in front of a webcam, and we asked them very pointed questions they could answer very quickly about how they overcame certain challenges. We then took that information, published it in a playlist that kind of looks like YouTube, best we could with the tools that we had, and made that available to people. So it was a way to access a more structured training offering, but then find different nuances in the information. So maybe I published 12 videos about how to overcome a particular challenge, and maybe only one resonated with you. But it also allowed me to get around some of the challenges I was facing, which was getting stakeholder agreement. Because I would ask 5 different managers how to do a certain thing, I'd get 5 different answers. I can't train the 5 different ways to do things, but I can crowdsource user-generated content about how to solve problems in different ways and make that available as an on-demand resource, in this case, a video resource. And then finally, push training. This is the stuff, again, a lot of organizations are leaning on. The structured classroom session, online course, compliance training, the things we make people do, onboarding, long-form programs, they don't go away. But in my opinion, these things should be the last resort when trying to help people learn how to do their jobs better. They should be reserved for when something is especially challenging or complex or requires going through a very regimented flow of experiences and content so that we can handle more problems using a wider array of resources and go after the really complicated stuff with our heavy resources only when it's required. So that's a walkthrough of how I define these different layers, and hopefully you've been able to start matching up the different tools and tactics that you're using and fitting them into these different slots. Because the idea is rethinking how we apply all of these different tactics, closing different gaps, because that allows us to fundamentally change the experience of learning. It goes from something that's very programmatic, that's very push-oriented, we make things and then ask or force people to go through them, to something that becomes a continuous part of the experience, where people can access what they need when they need it, that they're continuously receiving coaching and practice opportunities, and we're leveraging data to inform those experiences. And into that continuous experience still comes the structured training programs when they're the right solutions, and it's ultimately this overall continuous experience that helps us get to the results we're trying to achieve as a learning team. Hopefully that made some sense. I'll assume that everyone is nodding in vigorous agreement because I'm just staring at the lens and I can't see you. Step 3, now we have to use everything I just said. So the idea here is, like I said, we're building infrastructure, we're installing plumbing, we're putting these mechanisms in place so that we can handle whatever comes up. So whether the next priority is a product thing, a process thing, a compliance thing, a management training thing, a health and safety thing, we now have the mechanisms in place to go after those problems using a consistent and scalable approach. So the idea here is that first, we have to understand what problem we're trying to solve before we can apply our new framework. So that requires us to close this gap. So the process begins right here. Before we make a thing, we have to figure out what we're going to try to accomplish. So what's the result we're going to try to achieve, and then we're going to work backwards. So we're going to start by working with our subject matter experts and stakeholders to identify what's the actual result you're trying to achieve. So when someone comes to you and says, I need training on, we need safety training. Great. Safety is a very vague word. What is the specific thing you're trying to achieve? How are people getting hurt on the job, right? What is the safety concern? How did you know that you had a problem that brought you to me to ask for training? How are you measuring that? That's what we should be prodding people for, to understand what's the specific problem we're trying to solve. I can't fix safety, but if our major safety concern is that people are hurting their backs because they're lifting inappropriately in the warehouse, I can go after that problem. That's much more clearly defined as part, potentially, of a larger safety conversation. Now, what do people have to do on the job? What does performance look like? When people are lifting that box, what should it look like? What are the right behaviors we're combining to get to that result? So I'm training not just to what people know, but what they're actually expected to do on the job. Julie Dirksen said something great to me a long time ago. If I was to take a picture of good performance, what does it look like? That's what I can train to. I can't train to a vague outcome. Now we're back to the required knowledge component. What do people have to know in order to do that thing? If you're going to lift effectively in the warehouse, what do you have to know about lifting procedure, right? You have to know the process to work through as you're lifting a box so that you don't strain your back. Simple example, but hopefully it resonates with a lot of you. Everyone has safety training of some type. And now we're at the solution stage. Now we're going to figure out what's the right way to improve the knowledge, to help people change their on-the-job behavior. That's going to help the organization achieve the result. And then it's also going to work backwards to help us prove the value, because we can actually measure each of these steps along the way. Because I can measure who takes the training, how it changes their knowledge, behavior change on the job, and the results that we see as an organization. So it's not just helping me build a more targeted solution, it's going to help me actually measure the impact of that solution when we get there. So now we're going to apply our framework. We have to consider a couple of things first. Could I make this more complicated? There's a whole write-out on my website if you're like, where did he just go? In addition to the deck, I've written all of this down. But we're going to consider things like context. We have to think about the person we're going to try to help. If we're trying to help a person who works in a contact center, as compared to a person who works at home, as compared to a person who works in a warehouse, that's very different settings. It's going to change a lot of things about the different tools and mechanisms, time available, a lot of context to consider. So context wins. So we have to consider context. Criticality. How problematic is failure for this topic? If we're talking about overcoming a common customer objection, that's a lot lower level of criticality than this gets people hurt on the job. So how bad is failure? That's going to help us determine how much of our framework we're going to use. How difficult is this topic for someone to master? Right? Flying an airplane, real hard. Figuring out how to overcome a sales objection, not as hard. So we have to have that in mind as well. And then finally, timeliness. When do people need this help? How bad is this problem for our organization? The answer is almost always yesterday. But again, if you consider the different types of things or priorities you're being faced with, you can get a sense of these 4 different criteria. I'd love to say there's a formula for this. There just isn't. But these are the things we should be thinking about before we then head back to our framework. So let's say that we've gone through those 4 different ideas, right? We've identified the specific problem we're trying to solve, and now we're thinking, how critical is this? How bad is failure? Well, it's not, in this case, not going to get anyone hurt, not going to cause a major problem for the organization. Great. Complexity, not really hard, something that someone could learn if they have access to the right information. Don't need to go through like a structured training program. Great. When do they need it? They need it now because it is causing a problem. So we need to get something out there very quickly. And context, contact center agents. So something that really needs to slide nicely into the day because they're on the phones all day. Well, in that case, maybe we start at the bottom. We make shared information available, make sure people have access to resources, make sure they know where to go for help, and maybe we don't activate the rest of the framework. Again, we just use the pieces that we need to solve the problem based on all the criteria we've talked about so far. But now there's a new problem. Reset the framework. This has safety considerations. This has compliance considerations. This is heavily looked at. High level of complexity. Hard for people to learn this. We're not jumping to the top of the framework and just doing the programmatic stuff though, but we are going to do the programmatic stuff. We're starting at the bottom still, making sure shared information is available, that people have a place to go for help after the training's done, that we're going to put practice exercises to make sure people remember the right things, that they're executing it effectively on the job. We're going to arm managers with the ability to be able to coach effectively to these types of behaviors that we're trying to change. And we're also going to push a training program. So we're going to use the whole framework in that case because that challenge requires a more rigorous and programmatic approach. So now here comes a real world example. The names have been hidden because lawyers exist, but this is an actual company. The problem that they had was related to theft. So they were looking to reduce their shrink rate amongst both customers and employees. And for this particular organization across hundreds of stores in a retail environment, this was a 7-figure problem that they were trying to solve. So the initial request is, well, we clearly need training on how to prevent theft. That was what we wanted to do. But in this organization, every employee was already trained on how to prevent theft. When were they trained? Feel free to answer out loud. Again, you don't have to type in the chat, just answer out loud. They were trained during onboarding, all of them. What else is happening during onboarding? Everything is happening during onboarding. Is theft the biggest concern for a retail associate when they first join an organization? No. When are they likely to face theft? Who knows? They might not face a theft issue for months on the job, especially not something that's internal theft. So that was the struggle. It wasn't that they didn't have training. It was that the training wasn't matching the reality of what the need was in terms of the behaviors they needed people to do on the job in order to help them reduce their shrink rate problem. So let's work through the process. Here's what we did. First, the audience, retail associates across a several hundred store network of retail locations. What's the problem we're trying to solve? We're trying to reduce shrink rate. In this case, we did have specific goals we were trying to achieve. A relatively small percentage of reduction for this organization was going to be a 6-figure savings. That's considerable for any type of training outcome for this particular challenge. What do we need people to do on the job? Well, they need to be able to see it. They need to know what theft looks like, and they need to report it. They need to take the right action, not the wrong action. You can do wrong things when it comes to theft as well. They need to be able to take the right action to take action on theft, internal and external. What do they need to know? Well, they need to understand the policies. What is theft, both for customers and employees, especially employees. And they also need to understand what common indicators of theft are. They need to know what they're looking for when it comes to the potential for a loss prevention situation. And then finally, what are we going to build? How are we going to solve this problem to drive that knowledge, change that behavior, and get to the results we're trying to achieve? Well, like I said, four criteria. Context, retail associates. So these stores are pretty small. They have limited number of associates on the floor at any given time. So we can't deploy something that's very programmatic because we can't pull a lot of people off the floor. It would take a long time to push something out that required people to get off the job for any considerable period of time. Criticality, it's a moderate deal. No one's getting hurt as a result of this, but it is an expensive problem for the business. Complexity, it's not hard. It's just kind of knowing what to look for and making the right decision. It's not a super complex challenge. Timeliness, now, 7-figure problem they're currently experiencing. So here's how we applied the framework to solve that problem. We started at the bottom and we said, what information is available on this particular topic that people can use in order to solve this problem while they're doing their job? The answer was, well, there's a theft policy. Where was the policy? In the handbook. Where was the handbook? We don't know because they were given the handbook on the first day on the job. What else was in that handbook? Everything. Was the handbook in the intranet? Yes, it was. Where was it? It was buried dozens of pages deep in a document that also had time off policies in it and uniform policies in it. It had everything in it. So it was basically inaccessible. People didn't have a place to go for a resource that they needed to look up, and it wasn't very practical. It was the policy. It wasn't, here are some common theft indicators to look for when you're working on the job. So first we closed that gap. We made sure that information was available in a more readily available spot. In this case, it was still the intranet, but it was something that they could access from the devices in their store. Point of sale systems on the counter, back computer, that type of stuff. So we made sure that you could go to this place and search theft and find it, right? Not buried in the handbook anymore. Lift it out and turned into actionable policy information people could use on the job. We went up one layer. How do you get help? You don't know the policy, something's going on. How do you ask for help? Well, 2 things. One, we made sure their managers understood the policy and were there as a key resource in the retail location for people to go to and make sure the employees knew that. And 2, this company actually had a hotline. They had a loss prevention hotline. No one knew they had a loss prevention hotline because when were they told about it? During onboarding, it was in the handbook. So we made sure that information was more readily available and visible inside the work location. We haven't trained anybody yet on anything. One more layer. We're going up one more to reinforcement. How do we make sure people know how to use that policy information? So it's not, I'm seeing something, let me go look it up on my intranet. It's, I can take the appropriate action, report, I can see my fellow employee doing something that I think might be a problem, and I can take the appropriate action. We use the idea of burst reinforcement in this case. So when employees clocked in for their shift, they were asked through their point of sale system 2 questions. But they weren't about the policy. They were about what actions to take if you saw this scenario taking place. How are you going to apply that information, those proven practices that we had made available to you? We didn't train people on it. We didn't release an e-learning about it. We just asked them questions in the system they were using to do their job, and they were using to clock in for their shift. So it had to hit them in the face, basically, when they were clocking in to start their shift. 2 questions a day. We did not go any higher. So we did not do anything special with managers. We did not do anything that required a training program. All of this took a couple of weeks to implement. And for the employee themselves, it took 2 minutes a day if they completed a burst reinforcement session. What was the result for this organization? This organization experienced about a 60% reduction in shrink over the first 6 months. So if you do the math on that, that's a 6-figure solution that came down to more readily available job aid information, the access to the hotline and reinforcing that managers are an important resource, and asking people 2 questions a day, multiple choice scenario-based questions. That's it. I'm not saying every problem is that easy to solve, but imagine what would have happened if we had gone through a more traditional approach and built a training program about theft that we then had to deploy with the loss prevention team, maybe doing a road show, and now we're going to all the locations, pulling people out. We're spending a lot of labor hours. Compare that traditional solution to this solution. I don't even think that solution would have gotten these results. And this is an amazing story. This happened several years back, that organizations continuing to use these types of ideas within their retail environment. So hopefully that example brings some of this to life for you. And as we start to wrap up today, how do you get started? So I've said a lot of things. I have had 6 colored blocks on a white screen, and I said that might be helpful. So where do you go from here? The reality is this is a long road to try to get people in our own teams, within our organization, stakeholders that are asking us for very specific training programs, to get people to think differently about the role that learning plays and how we can approach solving knowledge and skill problems in the workplace. So there's a couple key areas that I like to recommend people start thinking about or start working their way towards. The first is how we design solutions. So I already walked through this. And this is a process that a lot of organizations use. I know there's some similar tools out there that have kind of a similar vibe to this idea of starting with the result first and working your way back. But there's some additional considerations that I like to put in place as well. Because like I said, this isn't just about how we design solutions, it's putting in place how we can more effectively implement and measure a solution. So it helps us consider things like, when we decide on a solution, how are people going to access that solution? How are we going to get people to engage and understand that there's value in spending their limited time on a training program or training solution that we're providing? So those are key design considerations. Going from knowledge to performance, how do we make sure that people are not just growing their knowledge, but their confidence in their knowledge? That's where reinforcement is a critical play, because it's not just about what you know, it's about how confident you are in what you know. Making sure they're motivated to apply that knowledge on the job, which is not necessarily something that we can control, but something we have to consider. And that people have the opportunity to apply that knowledge. That's, again, where reinforcement and positioning training as close to the opportunity to apply is a critical part of our design. And then finally, going from job behavior to results, making sure people have continued opportunities to refine and get feedback so that what they are doing on the job is what's needed to help people get to that result, and that they have continued support along the way. So in order to make this work, I do think we have to learn a lot and evolve our own practices as well. Here's a big list of things to think about, but everything from how much do we understand about that employee context, the reality of working in the positions we're supporting every day. How aware are we of the next business priority, of the decisions our organizations are making that are going to dictate the priorities we're working on moving forward. I just talked through designing an overarching experience, not just content, but the overall experience of how we're going to deploy that through the plumbing that we've installed as part of our conversation. I've mentioned ideas around learning science and motivation and confidence. Influence is something I'm going to go into in a little bit. This is going to make us more agile and more proactive. It's more about enablement than it is really about learning in this conversation. And I just always like to talk about writing. Remember that whole wiki experiment I talked about earlier? One of the biggest things we had to overcome was writing in a way that was more useful to the people we were supporting, because we were very used to writing instructional content and technical content. We didn't write like people. We wrote like lawyers. So we had to work on our writing skills a lot so that people could take the information we were giving them and understand it and apply it very quickly. So I think writing is an understated skill in our profession. But back to that influence idea, it's critical if you're going to try to implement any of these ideas, if you think anything I've said is interesting, how do you get people to start thinking differently? Because if you're on, you're in alignment with what we're talking about here today, how do you get other people to think this way? And it's identifying who are the people within your organization that you can start having conversations with to help your overall organization start thinking more as an ecosystem. So it starts within our training teams, but it also includes the people we're supporting every day, right? The frontline manager team, the executive stakeholders, our subject matter experts. What's interesting about this profession is that it's our job to understand the intricacies of learning, right? How learning works. It's not anyone else's job. We need them to appreciate that we're the subject matter experts. However, everyone has an opinion on how we do what we do because everyone's been to school. Everyone went to a training program that one time and now wants you to do that thing that they went to that they really liked that one time. So we need to take an influencer's approach, and it doesn't start with walking into a senior meeting and saying, this is our strategy, because that's never worked for me. It starts with solving problems, creating solutions that are proven to work, and showing people what doing things differently can actually do. I'm a huge fan of yes-anding people, if anyone's an improv student. So when people come to you and they say, we need you to build an e-learning on this safety topic, it's very unlikely that you might have the political clout to be able to say, no, we should do this instead, because I saw that guy say it's good. That's not going to work. I spent a lot of my time in early years with all of these ideas saying, yes, I will build that e-learning that I don't think you need. Didn't say that out loud, inner monologue. And I would also like to build this wiki article. And then we will put them both out there and we will see what people say. And we will see that people are using the article much more effectively than they are using the e-learning they did that one time, right? So it's about proving through small iterations, small experiments, that these types of things can work and starting to change people's mentality and using these case studies that you generate in order to help overall start to shift your strategy. And like I've already said a couple times, frontline managers are a critical part of the story. If we don't have them included, we're going to lose the influencing battle because they have so much influence over how people do their jobs every day. So to wrap up, here's a couple of steps I recommend if you like anything I've said today, moving forward, starting with L&D, sharing this conversation, feel free to take my presentation materials. Like I said, I've got a full write-up on the Modern Learning Ecosystem Framework. Feel free to share it with any team members you have, and I'm happy to answer questions both today and after today if anything would be helpful to you. Find champions who already think differently. My favorite was a woman named Omega, who used to be a member of the training team, then became a member of the operational management team. She was the person I did a lot of work with early on because she had great influence within the operation. So it was something that Omega liked, not something that the training guy liked and found valuable. Explore frontline employee motivations. You got to understand why people are doing what they're doing and what's going to help fit into those ideas. It's not just about extrinsic motivation. It's about understanding internally what motivates people to try to do their jobs better so that we can fit our solutions into that experience. Measure, report, and share stories. It's about small wins, solving small problems that help build up to a grander strategy, even if you already have that plan in the back of your head. Making your champions the heroes. I firmly believe L&D's not Batman, right? We're Alfred. We're the guy in the chair. We're not the guy standing on the stage saying, look how well these things are working. We're the folks behind the scenes creating heroes within our operation. So I really enjoy taking that approach. Leveraging voice of the employee, which I said several times. It's really hard for management to shoot down things that their employees are seeing great value from. And starting small but thinking big. Like when we built that wiki, I was always thinking, how does this work when we get to thousands and thousands of pieces of content and thousands of users? Even though in the beginning, we started with a couple of hundred people and a couple of hundred pieces of content. So ultimately, that's my story and how I think we can finally solve this balancing act of getting people the support they need every day to solve those high priority problems, but at the same time, providing an opportunity for people to have access to the right resources so they can continue to develop and learn and address the needs that they'll have moving into the future. And overall, a learning ecosystem requires content and technology. They're critical parts of the equation, especially if you're supporting a large distributed audience, like a lot of the folks I work with on the front line. But our focus is really about people and the human experience and the way we're fitting our solutions into what people are doing every day. So that's my story. Before we head into any questions and answers, I see chat has moved, but I haven't looked at it yet because, I get distracted. I would like to invite everyone, if you're curious about more around the Frontline story, my team's doing an event that's free next week online. So if you have any time, Monday or Tuesday, feel free to head over to exonify.com/conference. We have some great speakers coming to town, including some folks from Disney, Southwest Airlines, a lot of frontline forward organizations. They're going to share their stories about how they've really helped their organizations move forward and support their front lines over the past couple of months. So it's going to be a really cool event. Everyone's invited. And like I said, free to attend. Feel free to pop into any sessions you think are of great value. And like I said, feel free to reach out after today. Feel free to drop me an email if you have any questions about anything we talked about today. For some reason, I clearly failed to put the URL to the deck on the slide that I thought it was going to be on. So I'm going to type it into the chat because I am poorly prepared. Speaker tip, be prepared. It's sitting right there. So that, as well as other presentations that I've done, are all available there. And if you also go to my LearnGeek website, all of the framework I talked about is written out. But like I said, happy to answer any questions you might have now or in the future. Feel free to drop me a note via email or on Twitter. With that said, what did I miss in the question panel? What can I do to be helpful? How can I help make this information more useful to you?
So in regards to your wikis, there was a question about what was the ratio of your team versus the total population for the 7,000 articles?
So am I interpreting that correctly to say, was it how many people were on my team versus how many people used the content?
That's how I understand it.
Gotcha. Generally speaking, it was a moving target because of the nature of that business was constantly kind of restructuring. But generally speaking, we were upwards of, I had 10,000 licenses on the user side. And my team, the people that actually worked directly with me, never really increased to more than 8 on my personal team. But that said, by the time we got to real scale of content, by the time that I didn't know what was in the thing, right? Day one, I knew what was in it. By the time I left, I had no idea what was in that thing. We had hundreds of contributors, and the idea there was that my team took less and less of an active role in building content and more in terms of curating and crowdsourcing other authors. So we would go out to different business units, different influencers at all levels of the organization and bring them in and train them on how to build content directly into the platform. So rather than have a product owner come to training and say, I need to get this information out there, we would just enable them, train them on how we were doing it, and then we would just kind of check in the background to make sure we were maintaining a consistent experience. That's how we scaled. We would never have been able to scale if learning and development was the only one building the content.
Yeah, and if I could add, because I also worked on that team, JD, so it was a great experience and, you know, an awesome tool. And, you know, I left the company this year, but it was our go-to, it was our knowledge management system. It really, you know, was, I mean, the job you guys did, JD, I mean, I can't believe, I joined the team after you left, but it really resonated well with, you know, the whole of our team. We grew the team from 8 to 16. When I left the company, I think, you know, we were 16 members on the team, and it was really awesome. We had to take shifts to actually manage that system, which was really great. And there was a lot of engagement from, you know, the admissions, the financial aid team. There was, you know, so much engagement. So thanks for sharing that.
No problem. And I remember we had like a small party when we hit 1 million page views, which I think took us less than a year.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where it's like, that's great. It means nothing, but it's great. So now let's figure out, it was also a great way to start digging into data in different ways in that particular project. But I'm also glad that the legacy lives on, and I'm pretty sure you saw my face a lot because once I did a certain amount of work inside that system, you couldn't shut me off. So,
yep, the SharePoint, everything, your name is there, still there.
Legacy.
Great work.
Okay, so another question is, how will you incorporate these concepts at an organization that is implementing a new and aggressive change initiative where they believe everyone should go through a set of training programs?
So if there's a major change initiative, how does this work is kind of what I take away from there. So like I said, I see the overall conversation that we just had, I see as kind of a plumbing conversation. So I see it as installing these different mechanisms and tools so that no matter what the initiative becomes, we're able to activate a consistent tool set so that on the other side, the employee doesn't have to keep up with us. Because that's another thing I identified through various companies I worked for, is that every time we did a new training program, because we were evolving as a training team, the employees had to keep relearning us. So they basically had to say, what are they going to do to me this time? Where last time it was an instructor-led session and a job aid. Now they got me doing a series of e-learning videos. And next time they're going to do this other thing. Like, what are we doing here? So if we take that more ecosystem view and we put the mechanisms in place and we deploy them consistently, regardless if it's a major change initiative, new product, safety training, the employees getting what they need through similar channels, we're just lighting up different channels at different times. So they know. Back to the wiki example, I think I saw a question, what was the wiki? It's a platform called Confluence, which is made by a vendor called Atlassian. Cheapest piece of technology I've ever used. Still love it to this day. Best, if you're looking for a wiki, it's still my best recommendation for a wiki platform. So, the employees knew the wiki is used for this, right? I go here to get certain types of things. We had a learning management system. I go there for certain types of things. We had Adobe Connect for our webinar platform. We use that for certain types of things. Like I said, my team at Exonify, that's how I met my current employer, was at Kaplan. So Exonify was used for certain things. So we maintained that consistency of experience and that consistent plumbing. And then when the new thing arose, we lit up certain elements of that, but the employee was getting the same experience using the tools the same way, but just to deal with different problems in that case. So hopefully that is an answer, maybe.
And then what are ways to understand a business environment to define business outcomes we want to achieve?
Yeah, so how do we kind of understand, especially if you, because learning and development's interesting. A lot of us are born from operational roles, including myself. I didn't go to school for this, right? I have never actually taken a formal certification training program, anything like that. I'm entirely based on experience, but I'm born from operational roles, which is why I'm so passionate about frontline employees, because that's where I started. So a lot of us come from operational roles, so we know enough about the business to be able to kind of lean into that context and that reality. But some of us maybe are hired guns. So we come from outside. We've never done the job. We're learning and development people, but we're not close enough to the context. And there's the whole seat at the table conversation. So some of the smartest things I've ever done is I regularly, when I work in organizations, go back into the operation myself. So in a contact center, I was never ambitious enough to actually take a phone call because I didn't want to ruin someone's experience, but I would spend time within the contact center operation with people doing the job so I could get a feel and an understanding of what it was like. I did the same thing at Disney. I would go back and put the costume back on, even in learning and development roles, and go back into the operation to get a sense of what the day-to-day reality was like for the people I was supporting. And then from a business awareness perspective, that's a matter of having a lot of conversations with a lot of people, even outside of formal project requests. And something I do today. I join a lot of meetings I don't have to be in because it's where I hear things, especially in a large, complex organization. So either you, a member of your team, are they plugging themselves into the right influential people across your business so they hear things as they're coming, as the priorities are changing, as things are becoming more important in the organization before it turns into a project request? Because by then it's often too late for us to do the best things we can do to help people and get ahead of the problem. And then I also come back to data. That's where I think we really have to fix our data and measurement problem, because data can, if done correctly, help us see those problems emerging before they become a major conversation. And I'll go back to the wiki again as an example. One of the early things we did was we plugged Google Analytics into the wiki, free measurement tool. And it didn't give me the best data in the world, but it did allow me to see certain things like search terminology and what pages were used most commonly and how people navigated through the system, and allowed me to ask questions like, why are people searching for this term so much right now? Right? Is there something wrong? Is something changing I don't know of? Should we be providing training on this and we're not? So that data allowed me to get a little bit more proactive in that type of a conversation. So I think it's a multifaceted approach, but I think data is a huge part of our ability to get more proactive with business conversations.
So there's one more question, but we are out of time. I don't know if you want to take a couple more minutes to answer.
I'm not going anywhere. So when we're done, I will still be sitting right here. So happy to answer.
What about measures to work with senior leaders to foster buy-in, engage them, and drive reinforcement?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
What about measures to work with senior leaders to foster buy-in, engage them, and drive reinforcement?
So I interpret that as, how do we get people to buy into reinforcement as a tactic and idea? Yeah. So again, I've never walked into any stakeholder meeting outside of learning and development and said, let's talk about learning science. and how the brain actually works and why reinforcement's a critical thing. Some people are interested. A lot of people aren't, because not their domain, our domain. So I try to make the conversation around reinforcement as practical as possible. I'll often use some commonplace examples of reinforcement. So things, my boss actually does a really cool conversation around asking people, what did you have for dinner last Tuesday? And people don't remember what they had for dinner last Tuesday. And then they think about it for a little while, and then they remember. She's like, great. And then she does the rest of the conversation. Then she comes back at the end and says, oh yeah, what did you have for dinner last Tuesday? And they remember. And we go, that's what reinforcement does. That's what question-based learning can do. So making it as practical as possible is a great way to show people, and then maybe running small experiments. Or maybe this is where you potentially bring case studies from outside the organization. So are there other teams out there, maybe similar to yours, similar business to yours, or maybe just organizations that your stakeholders have heard of or they respect, where they've been using these types of tactics, that you can say, look at the results that they've seen, and how can we apply these ideas here? Because sometimes you'll say, this is a great idea, it's learning science, it's proven practices, right? This is awesome. I'm the learning person. This is good, right? And they look at you and they're like, yeah, but we're not interested in that. Then you bring information from outside, you bring an external subject matter expert with you, and they say the same thing you said, and suddenly they're like, that's great. We should do the same thing they're doing. And you're sitting there like, I said that. But sometimes people need that external proof point in order to believe in it enough to make the investment in time and resources in your organization. So a couple of different ideas there, but like I said, happy to have an additional conversation about any challenges you may be facing.
And I think that's all we have.
Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'll hand back off to the team if you have anything else to say with anyone who's remaining, but thank you very much for your time and attention today. Thank you for everything you're doing to support your teams, your organizations, and be well and have a great rest of your week. Hope to see you next week at the Exonify conference. Feel free to pop in.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks so much, JD. It was an awesome session. Awesome. I really loved it. So yeah, we're really glad to have you, and hopefully we'll get to see you next time. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for attending.